It's been nearly 2 decades since the horror of 9/11. Dave, welcome. I'm honored to be joined by members of the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry. Dave Meiswinkle, welcome to the show.
Jason, thank you very much. We're honored to be on your show. Thank you very much.
And you've got a group of your associates with you today. Do you want to introduce everyone, and then we can get into the presentation?
I certainly would like to. Mick Harrison is our Litigation Director for the Lawyers Committee, and Meryl Nass, who is a doctor, an expert at Anthrax. She's a consultant for the Lawyers Committee. And Graeme McQueen, who is a doctor and professor of religion in Canada, and an author, is a member of our Anthrax Committee.
Right. And each of the distinguished panel members have prepared a presentation for us today. I think viewers are going to find this quite fascinating, Dave. Everybody knows the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry has worked extensively with architects and engineers. You guys have brought forward various lawsuits to compel the government to do what we all expect them to do: protect our life, our liberty, our property, something they've been failing grossly at doing.
Right.
So what are we going to get into today, Dave, and where would you like to begin?
Well, we're going to make a new announcement. As you mentioned, Jason, we have worked with architects and engineers, and in particular, right here in New York City, with the high-rise steel-structured buildings, we have a grand jury petition that we filed in the Southern District, and we have a lawsuit there now, basically to compel the U.S. Attorney and the Attorney General to acknowledge our petition and to present our evidence of controlled demolitions in the buildings, explosives, bombs, incendiaries. Now, this is startling for most people because if they followed the official story, the buildings came down because of office fires or because of jet fuel that caused the office fires. But our evidence is contrary to that. And we have 47 exhibits that are conclusive or dispositive of those bombs in the buildings. But now we're doing something a little different. In our strategy sessions, we discussed the possibility of doing 5 grand jury petitions, including the government misconduct and obstruction in allowing the 9/11 crimes to happen, and preventing a good investigation or a proper investigation. Then there's the Shanksville crime or the crash in Pennsylvania, and then there's the Pentagon, what happened at the Pentagon. But today we're here because we have met. Our Anthrax Committee is composed of 4 top attorneys and 3 top researchers and investigators. And we've been working on anthrax. And the Anthrax Attacks of 2001 occurred about a week after 9/11, and it came in 2 waves, and actually some people say 3 waves, but at least we know for sure 2 waves. And the attacks came right up here to Tom Brokaw and CBS and NBC and ABC. And the other attack came to Washington, D.C., to 2 U.S. Senators, Patrick Leahy and Thomas Staxel. And there was an attack down in Florida, too, where the first individual, Mr. Stevens, that worked for AMI, which is the National Enquirer and Sun magazines or papers, he unfortunately died. So
from anthrax?
Of anthrax poisoning on October the 5th. Now, that was the first time that we were aware of anybody dying from anthrax, from this anthrax attack. And what we've done now is we've been meeting for about 6 months, and we've met and talked with a lot of people. We had as our guest Richard Lambert. We spoke to him at length. And Richard Lambert was the head of the FBI for 4 years during that investigation. And he was very candid. And he became eventually a whistleblower getting out of the case. And we'll probably discuss that further today with other speakers. But he was very dissatisfied, and he had a lot of exculpatory evidence that the alleged killer, or the anthrax killer mailer, Bruce Ivans, was innocent.
And for the non-lawyers who are watching, exculpatory evidence is evidence that would prove that he's innocent.
That's 100% right, yes. So we met with him, and we met with other people. We made real good contact with the people at USEMRID. That's the United States Military Research Institute of Infectious Diseases at Fort Detrick. And they have been very cooperative and have given us a number of important documents which you can access on our website, lc4911.org. I believe we have right now 47 exhibits there. Now, what we had tended to do, Jason, originally, and we're still doing it, is to put together a grand jury petition like we did in New York.
Yep.
And we were intending to file that today or tomorrow. But what happened was we received more new evidence from the USEMRID scientists. And we also found additional vaults, FBI vaults of evidence that we hadn't looked through. So as a strategy, what we did was we reversed our 5-point strategy, and we took the third step, which we were going to do, and reversed it with the first step. So the first step was to file a grand jury petition. Right now, that petition is probably 140 pages or more. So there's a lot of work that went into it.
Sorry, Dave, how large is a typical grand jury petition?
well, our last one was probably about 57 pages, and Mick could correct me if I'm wrong with that. So this is a lot of new research that the Lawyers Committee is doing. That's what's really exciting. No one has followed up, I don't think, on this as we are, as attorneys. And what we really want is action on this. We're very serious in investigating it, spending the time, making the connections, and then going forth in the court, either to get a grand jury investigation going, or what we're going to tell you now, today, we're going to be doing, because we want to do the best job possible with this grand jury investigation. We need more time to examine the evidence we have. So we have enough evidence to do what we were going to do on the third step, and we've been thinking of doing it for a long time.
We should point out that this whole impaneling of a grand jury, this is stuff that Robert Mueller should have done as the FBI director 19 years ago, isn't it?
Listen, you're right, and it was done. This is the kicker. We'll get to it and what happened to it. But what we're going to do now, our third step, we're making our first step. Today, we are petitioning Congress. We're sending a petition that you may have now, that you can actually show the face of it, at least to the audience, along with the exhibits. And that's it right there. And we'll be talking about that a bit today. Mick will be talking about it a little bit more. It will be sent in today to various congressmen, and eventually all the Congress will receive this petition. Now there's 47 exhibits that go with it, and the exhibits are from USEMRID scientists, colonels, and they're from various doctors that worked at USEMRID, and that's at Fort Detrick. And it's from very prominent scientists. And we've discussed this topic with Martin U. Jones, who's one of the top in the country, and Anthrax, Barbara Hatch-Rosenberg, and Meryl Nass, who is one of your guests today, all right, who's our consultant. So we're trying to do our best we can to make it complete. And so, again, what we're doing today is announcing the Lawyers Committee is doing an investigation into the Anthrax attacks that killed 5 people, injured 17, frightened a nation, and preceded the Patriot Act and the wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. And what we're doing is today we're going to be giving to Congress a petition to ask them to get involved. Now, years ago, Rush Holt, the congressman from Princeton, New Jersey area, he had a bill, I think it was H.R. 721, to get an investigation going, a national investigation similar to the 9/11. So that would be one of the things that we want to do, to get a different type of counsel in there because of the evidence that we're going to show you of obstruction and or fraud and or just ineptness by the FBI. Now,
no shortage of that.
Now, what I would like to do is precede this with just to change the energy for a second, because all of this it exists within a context, and 9/11 was outrageous, as we all know. It was never examined properly, and we're still pushing to get that done. As everyone probably knows, there's no statute of limitation on murder, so we can keep it going as long as we can keep it going. But I just want to, again, put it in a little different flavor for a second, only for a second. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness on high. And that seems to be at least something that I regard, at least as we venture into these treacherous waters, that we are dealing with a great evil. And we have to be fortified to do that. And we are. The Lawyers Committee is fortified to do that, to go forward in that venture. Now, the key, there's a few keys, and Mick is going to fill these in. But one of the keys, of course, is that Bruce Ivins, who worked at USEMRID and who was a scientist there for many years, over 30, and who was, at least as much as we could see, beloved by his co-workers. You'll be able to see in your supporters or your viewers, Jason, can go on the Lawyers Committee, lc4911.org, and go to the exhibit list. On the top, it'll say Anthrax Congressional Petition. Hit on that, and you'll get the exhibit list. And there's 4 declarations there from 4 of his co-workers. They're all doctors, all high-level scientists, very high level, and 3 of them are colonels. And they're very upset. And the sense that I've gotten by talking to a lot of these people is that none of them believe that Bruce Ivins was the murderer. None of them.
Colonels in the U.S. Army.
3 of them, yes. Wow. In fact, we had our petition was reviewed by a colonel before we submitted it, and it was reviewed by one of the top scientists in anthrax in the country before we submitted it. So we believe what you read in these words here are accurate. We wouldn't put it out if we didn't believe it was accurate. But so, as I said, Bruce Ivins, I worked at USEMRID for over 30 years, and he was beloved by his fellow workers. He was a juggler. He taught people how to juggle. He would use stilts, big stilts. He played the piano. He was a singer and a poet, and he was a jokester in some ways. But overall, he was a good guy. And
smeared by the FBI.
What's that?
He's been smeared by the FBI and the press.
Totally smeared. Now, like all of us probably, there's things that we like to keep to ourselves. But because he was so probably honest and forthright with the FBI, whatever he told them, they investigated him as a suspect, but they sort of smeared him with it too.
Wow.
And they presented it in a way that it created a circus. And he had some mental health issues to begin with. He made it worse. And in about March of 2008, there was possibly a suicide attempt with Valium and alcohol. And then there were other involvements that we won't go into here, but he eventually alleged to have committed suicide on, I believe it was July 28th or 29th of 2008.
But you know, Dave, I've spoken to so many FBI, CIA, and other government whistleblowers who tell me that when you bring forward this unfavorable information, they allege there are these campaigns to try to drive an individual to suicide.
Well, you're right about that. We think that too. I have two people I talked to, witnesses, very close to Bruce Ivins, told me he was murdered.
Yep.
That's what they told me. There is the case, I think maybe Meryl will talk about, Perry Mixel, who was an alleged suspect at one time. He ends up drinking himself to death. There's a case, too, with Stephen Hatfield, that he eventually is a tough guy. He sues the FBI after he's hound dogged for a long time and wins over $5 million.
Wow.
And immediately after Hatfield is left, they go after Ivins.
Wow.
And Ivins then is, apparently he's on 3 strong antidepressant medications, which the FBI knew. Even their psychiatrist, my understanding, is warned them to back off. The guy's fragile. They knew, they were watching him 24/7. They knew he went to the drugstore. They knew he got Tylenol. He went there twice. And apparently, at least that was, they said he died of Tylenol poisoning. But there was no autopsy performed. All right. And I believe his body was cremated.
Wow.
I think because the family wanted it, but I'm not sure about the latter. But there was no autopsy. So what our investigation has shown is that one is that Bruce Ivins is not the anthrax killer. He was involved with the mailing, and he was involved with the producing of the anthrax that eventually was sent out. And the second prong is this, that the FBI was complicit in setting him up, in a sense, or using him as the unfortunate person to blame all this on, the scapegoat. And they conducted an investigation which, for those that are familiar with the 9/11 and the World Trade Center, one of the questions that was asked when the World Trade Center collapsed is, why did you choose the least possible hypothesis and not the most likely? In other words, the most likely hypothesis for the collapse of the buildings in New York City were bombs and explosions and controlled demolition. And there was 120 firemen, I believe, and Graeme knows that because he did the original work on that, that heard or experienced explosives or more. And there was a lot of evidence, as we put forth, to indicate that. But they chose the least possible. Now, there's protocol in the government for fires and for the police to do testing for explosives. It was not done.
Even President Donald Trump said he felt there must have been explosions in the
Right.
building to bring it down.
So, yes, and so using the same reasoning or logic to look at this situation, the situation at Fort Detrick was they made liquid anthrax. They dealt with liquid anthrax. And these 2 attacks had to do with, the first was a cruder, browner anthrax. And the second anthrax was a super fine. It was, and I'll let, the other speakers can speak to it, but it was something like no one's ever seen before. And when it was getting examined, it was coming out of the test tubes. It was so energized. This is, I think, from the Daxel. And we were told by a witness that came before our committee from USEMRID that the 12 people were contaminated by this stuff down in Yosemite when a top scientist failed to handle it properly because he was a top scientist but didn't feel that it could be that active.
Just threw it in the trash, right?
Well, no, this stuff what happens, it's so fine that the electric charges that would bind it together, they don't exist there. So it
allows it to become airborne.
It's almost like a gas. It's totally airborne. Listen to this. On 1 gram, it's not 1 million spores, not 2 billion spores. It's 1 trillion spores.
In a gram.
A gram.
Of this specially prepared. Dave, it sounds remarkably similar in composition to the nanothermite that's so microscopic that only a very sophisticated laboratory could create it.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. So with I think Mick will go into when the FBI tries to set up Ivans, they use a flask called RMR 1029, and there's a lot of talking about a contaminant that's in there called B subtilis, and there's also the silicon and tin, which is indicative of the super fine anthrax. So that can all be explained to you. It's a little complicated, but the bottom line is that, as I mentioned, Richard Lambert worked for the FBI at the time. He was head of the investigation and was totally frustrated, and we'll tell you how and why he was. And again, we've spoken to him. So as I said before, the major points of our investigation thus far are that Bruce Ivans was innocent, that it was a travesty of justice on him and his family, that only a congressional inquiry can probably help at least get the truth out, and that the FBI is a suspect. The most likely culprits, as I said before, the least likely was the scientists at Fort Detrick, because they only dealt with liquid. And to a man or woman, they said, we can't make it here. We don't have the equipment, and we don't know how to make it. And Bruce Ivans didn't. The likely suspects were Battelle Memorial, the CIA, works for the CIA, and they were working on 3 projects then.
That's a person, Battelle?
Battelle Memorial is a big, it's actually a nonprofit research, but it's all connected to government contractors, and Dugway Proving Ground. So they're the most likely because those ingredients I mentioned before with the B subtilis and the tin and the silicone, they're experts on that. All right?
Is that Battelle right there?
That's Battelle. That's it. So the 3 points again that I'm going to make in my little talk is that Bruce Ivans was innocent, and our investigation will prove that. The FBI obstructed the investigation and did so deceptively and fraudulently, and we can prove that, or at least we have evidence to indicate that. We'd like to do the third thing, which is let Congress investigate it or set up a special counsel to do so. And I'm sure that
not Robert Mueller.
Not Robert Mueller. No, exactly. And Mick and Meryl and Graeme can supplement that and have a lot more to add than what I just said. So I think that's what I wanted to say at this point in time. Thank you, Jason.
Yeah, and before we pass it on to our panel, I do want to remind Crowdsource the Truth viewers that they can support the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry by going to the website lcfor911.org. There is a donate button right here, and I presume you guys are a 501c3?
We are. We're a nonprofit 501c3, and our mission is we're dedicated to transparency and accountability, reference the government's the crimes of 9/11. So we're interested in investigating all the crime scenes and wish it had been done previously. And what I said, Jason, we don't like to say this in the sense of the FBI didn't do their job. We'd like to think that they're an honorable organization, and there are mostly honorable people in the organization. There are some people, though, up at top that aren't being accountable to the public and to morality at all either.
It's very interesting how we've seen many more examples of that type of behavior since 9/11 occurred. So I think a lot more people are aware that these things can happen.
You're right. 9/11 was the opening the Pandora's box. If we had investigated that properly, the world would be totally different today.
Absolutely.
Totally.
No doubt. And with that, Dave, we're going to hand it over to our panel. Who would you like to begin the conversation?
I think Mick would be good to follow up because he has done an incredible amount of work on the anthrax, what I was mentioning, the RMR 1029, the subtilis, and the silicone. And Mick can also tell you what crimes we're involved with as far as our grand jury petition, what crimes we may be looking at.
Mick, take it away.
Thank you, sir, and good to be here. Are you able to hear me okay?
Yes.
So, first of all, the Lawyers Committee got involved in this as an investigative project based on the good work of a number of people that came before us. That included Dr. Barbara Hatch-Rosenberg, Attorney Barry Kissin, Dr. Meryl Nass, who was with us, Dr. Martin Hugh Jones, a veterinary epidemiologist who's published on this. And recently, because we've talked to some of the folks who worked at the U.S. Army facility, the long name, which I'll only say once, is U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, which is why we call it USAMRID, which is the acronym, at Fort Detrick in Maryland. But we got some very interesting information from several of the scientists there. And Colonel Anderson, Arthur Anderson, gave us a number of documents, which you'll find in our exhibits. And he mentioned his own theory. And you may or may not remember that the FBI basically pointed the finger at Bruce Ivins based on what they called some state-of-the-art science, which in their view created a fingerprint in the attack anthrax that would point to its source. And they looked at the DNA of the attack anthrax, and they found a number of DNA variants, which they call morphs, basically mutations. And based on the analysis, they determined that they should be able to identify where the anthrax came from, not necessarily in the final form it was used in the letters, but where it started, its source, by looking at all the labs in the country and some out of the country that used anthrax and testing samples from each and determining which of those labs had a DNA pattern that showed these special morphs. And if there was only one, which I think was their theory, that should help them at least know where the culprits got their anthrax, the attack anthrax. Doesn't mean that the source was the culprit, but it means the anthrax would have come initially from there. And they ended up focusing their investigation on U.S. AMRID in Fort Detrick and on Bruce Ivins based on this DNA analysis of the fingerprint morphs. Colonel Anderson's theory was that the FBI got that totally wrong. And his basic reasoning was that, and a lot of folks don't know this yet, that Bruce Ivins, Dr. Ivins, at Fort Detrick had two basic stocks of anthrax. One was what the FBI focused on and talked to people about, which was called for short RMR 1029. RMR is a shorthand for a reference material receipt record. And the FBI focused on this. They called it a flask. It wasn't always in one flask, but this stock of anthrax. But Ivins also had another stock of anthrax that he made himself at Fort Detrick at USAMRID, and it was called RMR 1030. So the stock that you're showing on the screen, 1029, is what the FBI focused on. Now, the FBI did not go out of its way. You'll see it in their records, but they didn't often publicly talk about what was in 1029. Well, there were two things in 1029. There was about 85% of Ames anthrax that came from Dugway Proving Ground that was in 1029, and another 15% that Dr. Ivins produced himself at Fort Detrick, which came from his 1030 stock. Now, another fact the FBI did not, highlight in their public presentations was that they did test RMR 1030, Ivins' other stock, and they did not find the Morse. So these fingerprint Morse were not in Bruce Ivins' second stock. Now, keep in mind that the 1029 stock that the FBI said pointed to Bruce Ivins and U.S. Ambrid had two components. It had Dugway anthrax, and it had Ivins' 1030 anthrax. But the FBI found that Ivins' 1030 didn't have the Morse. So what does that mean? Well, if there are only two ingredients in 1029 and one of them didn't have the Morse, the other ingredient had to have the Morse, and that was Dugway anthrax. So we, of course, sorted this out and looking at the documents. And I don't know how many of the researchers had tripped over this, because I had to find the fact that 1030, Ivins' 1030 stock, was tested and showed none of these Morse didn't have the fingerprint. I had to find that out by looking at a footnote in the National Research Council's report of 2011, which was a year after the FBI closed its investigation. I'm not sure they ever mentioned this in their public disclosures. So, and then I had to figure out, well, okay, so if the Morse were in Dugway's anthrax and they weren't in Ivins' anthrax, what happened to the samples from Dugway? And why didn't the FBI report that the Dugway sample showed the Morse? And if they had reported that the Dugway sample showed the fingerprint Morse, then why would they be focused on Fort Detrick and Dr. Ivins and not on Dugway? The answer to that question about why they weren't talking about the test on Dugway's samples was not immediately obvious to me in looking at the documents. So again, we had to pour through the details. And we found a FBI report from their search. They did a search at Dugway. And they were given access to samples by Dugway of the production runs that Dugway had done to produce the anthrax that went into Bruce Ivins' 1029 flask. And there were maybe, 13 or so production runs. And so I said, okay, the FBI got the samples, so that should solve the problem. And then in reading the fine print in the document, which was a 3-page sentence in the middle of a bunch of the details, it said, none of the material recovered from these production runs at Dugway had live anthrax. None of the samples were what we call viewable. They were dead. Okay. Now, do they have to be live to test for DNA? No. So then I said, okay, they got the samples, they were dead, but they still should have been tested for DNA. So then I had to go search and see what the FBI did with the dead samples and why they didn't report that they tested them for DNA and found the fingerprint Morse. So the next thing surprised me, again, in the fine print of the NRC report, a year after the FBI closed its investigation, was that the FBI came up with a procedure or a policy that the NRC criticized as having no scientific basis, which was they decided not to test any samples that were not viewable. So they didn't test the samples that were dead, which means, even though I don't think they've told anybody in the way I'm telling you now, they didn't test Dugway samples. They didn't do the DNA analysis on Dugway samples. So that was their excuse, in my view. And this is one of the main conclusions in our petition to Congress that Dave announced. We'll explore it further in our more detailed grand jury petition, which we're working on. But at the moment, our conclusion is, and we invite anyone who's got evidence to the contrary to share it with us, that the FBI knew, for the same reason I just gave you, because they had all the documents we had, they knew that the Dugway anthrax had to have the fingerprint Morse. So their focus on Bruce Ivins and U.S. Amrit as sort of their narrowing of the suspect list, to me, that was bad faith from the beginning, because they knew Dugway had the same fingerprint that they say that Fort Detrick had. And they knew that the only reason that Ivins' stock had it, the fingerprint, was that it came from Dugway. So our evidence suggests to us that the FBI decided, and it looks to me to be intentional, they decided to not test the dead samples from Dugway for DNA, even though they could have. And that allowed them to say the only samples we have showing the fingerprint came from Bruce Ivins' 1029. But of course, they knew that that was a misrepresentation, because had they tested the Dugway samples, the same result, the fingerprint, would have pointed to Dugway. Now, they also had records, as we have, that shows that Ivins' 1029 anthrax went to Battelle in Ohio, and Battelle and Dugway shared anthrax as well. So the bottom line is, the FBI had no reason to narrow its suspect list to U.S. Amrit. And then, of course, they wanted, once they falsely got to that focus, which is only, Fort Detrick, U.S. Amrit, then they wanted to focus on Ivins. And their way to do that was another bad faith part of their purported analysis. They said that Ivins controlled 1029. It was in his possession. He had access to it. No one could get access to it without going through him. Well, that's not the case. We have information from the folks who worked at U.S. Amrit who say clearly that this flask you're showing, 1029, it was sometimes stored in Bruce Ivins' lab, but sometimes it was stored in another building, building 1412, in another room, I think it's room 115, at U.S. Amrit, and it didn't even have a lock on the door for the room in which the flask was stored.
Wow.
Now what that means is that 100 people or so just at U.S. Amrit would have had access to the same 1029 anthrax flask that the FBI says has the fingerprint of the attack anthrax. And then you add to that another 100 or 200 at Dugway and whatever it is at Battelle. And what you got is a large group of suspects, which the FBI has never narrowed. So the bottom line is, the FBI looked to narrow their suspects and used a bad faith method to do that. Now, the next question is for us, well, if you're going to narrow the suspects list legitimately, how do you do that? And there are some other smoking gun pieces of evidence that will get you there. One of them
Mick,
is,
if I could just interject before you go to the other evidence, what you're describing about this investigation into Dugway and Fort Detrick and deliberately not looking at the dead anthrax, it sounds remarkably similar to the FBI's refusal to look at the server that was allegedly hacked in the email scandal and the DNC, all this stuff that led to them concluding that Russia has hacked. We seem to be identifying a pattern and practice of FBI investigations where they're able to conduct them in such a way that they arrive at these preconceived conclusions that support manufactured narratives.
Yeah, it's almost like the same when we talked about the World Trade Center.
Right.
The failure to investigate the dust for explosives. That's the obvious thing to do, and they didn't do it.
So can't speak to the Russia thing, but no one's asked us to look at that yet. But we'll see. But the pattern may well be there, and it certainly exists in this case. And there's more to it, which I'm about to share with you. Two of the big smoking guns that the FBI did not want to talk about much. One was the contamination of the attack anthrax in the first wave of attacks with B. subtilis, which is another bacterium and used often as a simulant for anthrax. And that contamination is common, and you probably could guess where I'm about to say. It's common at Dugway Proving Ground. And it's so common that when Dugway did their production runs for the Ivins 1029 flask, the purpose of which was to create anthrax to use to test vaccines at Samrid, they had to discard some of their runs. They had to autoclave them because they were so contaminated with B. subtilis. They called it B. big EI, I'm probably mispronouncing that, which is for them a synonym. I think there's some fine distinctions between some subvariations of this family of or species of anthrax, but not that. It's actually, I'm not going to say it wrong, Astropius or something like that.
Yeah.
And Meryl probably knows this. Yeah. So anyway, but the production runs, several had to be discarded because of this contamination. So the FBI contracted out a study of that B. subtilis contamination and claimed that after analysis, even though the attack anthrax had it, that it was such a unique variety of B. subtilis that it didn't trace anywhere to anybody's samples of B. subtilis, which is a pretty good trick. Now, and who did the analysis that reached that conclusion? Well, that was one of the people on the suspect list. I believe it was. I believe Battelle did that particular analysis. It was either Battelle or Dugway. So you've got, as we say in our petition, some fox guarding the henhouse problems with the FBI investigation, because the folks that should have been openly on their suspect list, but they avoided for the reasons I explained, ended up getting some of the contracts to do the investigative work that basically kept them off the suspect list.
Mick, forgive me for interrupting again, but this is just, the pattern exists again, because the people that did the investigation, the forensic computer investigation into the server, was a private firm called CrowdStrike, which was started by a Russian expatriate and a former special agent of the FBI, Sean Henry, essentially creating an FBI cutout that is not the FBI, that's carrying out investigative work that should be done by the FBI, but in fact, as you've just described with Battelle, this CrowdStrike group, if anything, should be on the list of suspects.
Sure.
Well, hang on. We're not talking about that other investigation. So if Dave is agreeing with you, he's speaking for himself. We haven't gone there yet, but the pattern pointing out is here in the anthrax case. And the other big smoking gun was silicon or silicone, depending on which study you're looking at. And the first wave of the 2 attack letters had silicon in large quantities, about 10% of the entire weight of the New York Post letter was silicon. And even though the FBI wanted to say there was no sign of what they call weaponization by putting silicon externally, not inside the spores, but externally to separate them, the bulk of that silicon in the New York Post letter was external. It was not inside the spores. So that's something the FBI glossed over. They also didn't explain where it came from. And it didn't come from Fort Detrick and Bruce Ivins, because they did test his 1029 and 1030. 1029 showed no silicon. 1030 had a few spores with silicon, not much, nothing close to the Post letter. The second wave of attacks had silicon also. And interestingly, that silicon was mostly inside the spores, inside the exosporium on the spore coat. And as Dr. Martin Hugh Jones and others, and Meryl may talk about this, there is a method which was state of the art at that time to do microencapsulation. And it may have been used by the perpetrators, or it may have been used by the source of the anthrax innocently, and the perpetrators basically stole the anthrax and used it in the attacks. But that microencapsulation using silicon or silicone was another smoking gun. It pointed away from Bruce Ivins, away from Hugh Samrid, and Battelle had the capability and did some studies using silicon, as I understand it, or silicone. Dugway, I believe, had that capability. So another reason why basically the FBI was looking in the wrong direction and should have known it. Now, I don't know how much more time I have, but I'm going to stop in 60 seconds. And then if somebody wants to ask me questions, you're welcome to. The sort of clincher on the FBI's approach to this was some of the private investigators, Meryl was probably one of them, brought to Congress's attention this problem of the evidence of the Bacillus subtilis and the silicon not pointing to Ivins or Usamard, but pointing elsewhere, including Battelle and Dugway. And so Congress people, started to learn about this. And there was a hearing, congressional hearing, and Congressman Nadler and Senator Leahy asked Director Mueller from the FBI, how did you eliminate these two labs, Dugway and Battelle, from the suspect list? And after beating around the bush, the director of the FBI said, I'll have to get back to you on that, because he didn't know. And several months, yeah, well, it was his job. But anyway, he got back several months later to Congress, and he gave a very, in my view, illogical and disingenuous answer. And I'm going to paraphrase it here, but it's in our exhibits. You can read it and quote it. He basically said they eliminated the two labs, even though they had received samples of the 1029 anthrax with the fingerprint Morse in it, even though they had received it. They eliminated those labs from suspicion because even though they had the capability to produce the dry powdered anthrax that Dave talked about in the second wave, I don't know if he wanted to talk about the silicone yet, but even though they could have produced the dry powdered anthrax, they were eliminated because, and this is the part that doesn't make any sense, because they had not received samples of the anthrax with the fingerprint Morse, the 1029. So he said in the same sentence, they had received it, but they were eliminated from suspicion because they hadn't received it. And you'll have to stop and figure that one out, because I'm working on it and I still haven't got whatever logic was in his mind. Now, he may not have said what he meant, but what he said made no sense. Now, what he should have said, and what was not revealed to Congress and should have been put in his, at least his follow-up letter, he should have said, okay, Battelle got it, Dugway got it, meaning the anthrax with the fingerprint Morse, and they had the ability to use the silicon found, and they may well have had subtilis contaminated anthrax, which means they're more now the focus of the investigation, and Ivins and U.S. Amherst should be not the focus. He should have said that. He didn't say anything close to that. So let me stop there. That gives you the gist of what we're talking about. There is, of course, more detail.
Absolutely. So, Dave, we've got many other panel members with us. Who would you like to hear from next?
Let's hear from Meryl.
Sure. Dr. Meryl Nass, welcome to the show. And why don't you just share just a little background information about yourself for our viewers who are perhaps unfamiliar. You've done some breakthrough work studying anthrax and other infectious diseases.
Yes, I am the first person who was able to study an epidemic and show that it was actually due to biological warfare and not a natural occurrence. I did that, I published that in 1992, and I was studying the 1978 to 1981 anthrax epidemic and epizootic. So it was anthrax in people and anthrax in cattle, also in Zimbabwe during its civil war. So about 200 people that we know of died, and many thousands of cattle, and we don't know how many. I did that work. I've worked on the Anthrax Letters case. I've worked on several pandemics since then, and I'm an internal medicine physician.
Right. An MD, we should let everybody know, who is coming forward and talking about this stuff. YouTube hates it when we question the World Health Organization. And Doctor, of course, not questioning science is totally anti-scientific. We're constantly making new discoveries, and this is the only way, as far as I understand it, that medical technology and any technology moves forward, is by constantly questioning the results and using peer review and various aspects of the scientific method.
Yeah, science has a funny flavor right now, because everybody is invoking it, wrapping itself in science to claim whatever they want to claim. And the FBI in this case did the same thing. So I actually can't see what slide you're on, but I think we go to my slide 2.
Sorry about that. I forgot to bring up your PowerPoint, and let me do that right now.
So slide 1 is just me with a little bio, and
There we go.
slide 2.
Right, there's your slide 1.
Okay.
And slide 2, my apologies.
Okay. So my contention is that the FBI conducted a bumbling and incredibly expensive investigation that was not intended to find the perpetrator. And after earlier fails, the FBI had the death of Ivans, which they needed. They needed a death to close the case and pin it on somebody. And Bruce Ivans' death allowed them that opportunity. This is Bruce. I knew him a bit. I had known him since 1991. The FBI claimed in a nutshell that an Army researcher had sent the anthrax letters to foster his career and committed suicide as the FBI closed in. And FBI was hoping at first to make its case in the media. Remember, once he died and they pinned it on him, they never had to go to court and prove their case. So they tried to do it in the media with a whole succession of leaks. And FBI tried to create the image of just one more lone nut. But their leaks were so exaggerated and untruthful that they got caught. And the FBI had to apologize about a week after Ivans died. However, that did not stop them from repeating lies and exaggerations throughout the next several years of this case. So first of all, I'm going to just give you a ton of reasons why the FBI's case is no good, is made out of whole cloth. And the case only makes sense if you think backwards that, okay, they've got a death, Ivans has died, now they have to create a case. And so they had to work backwards and figure out what are the circumstantial, pieces of information we can use to try to pin it on Ivans at that point. When you look at it that way, then all of this crazy stuff makes more sense. Excuse me. So first off, the FBI knew, for the reasons that Mick and David have already outlined, that the anthrax didn't even come from Ivans' flask or from anywhere at Fort Detrick, because they were unable to find the Bacillus subtilis contaminant. And they also never found any spores that were prepared with silicon in the coat, the way the spores were in the second set of letters. Yet, FBI created a smokescreen using the term science. We have all of these brand new scientific techniques. They've never been used in microbial forensics before, and it's super good, and we're spending $100 million to do it, and everybody's going to be convinced. And they just kept repeating that for years, even before Ivans died, because it was a way they could pin the case on anyone and still say, we're using the science to do it. After Ivans died, to try to put a lid on things, the FBI held 2 press conferences for scientists and for journalists. And they had FBI minders who managed those press conferences, and they did not even identify the names of who all those people were. Unsatisfied, the House and Senate Judiciary Committees, particularly Congressman Nadler and Senator Leahy, held hearings the next month on the case. Director Mueller was the only witness, and he refused to answer most of the questions. The FBI then immediately afterwards arranged with the National Academy of Sciences to perform a review and investigation of the FBI's scientific techniques. And this was, Mueller promised this in the second hearing, basically to take some of the heat off himself, I think. That's what it seemed to me when I was in the room, and to ward off any other investigations, because there were calls in several important newspapers, like the Washington Post, asking for a real investigation or congressional investigation of the case. So the National Academy of Sciences was given a contract for about $900 million to do a review, and they began, and they had to use the information FBI gave them, and all their briefing people were from the FBI or FBI contractors. But FBI got wind of the fact that the report was not going to be favorable to their case. So they preempted the report, and in February 2010, issued their own report, Anthrax, announced the case was closed, and that was it. They also, shortly after that, gave this NAS committee another dump of data, which the committee then had to deal with. And so their report, and this was in the middle of them having a completed report already. So they had to review that, write another report, and it finally came out a year after the FBI's report and said that the FBI had failed to prove the anthrax in the letters had come from Ivan's flask. So what did the FBI do wrong? You know, the question, an easier question to answer is what did they do right? Because there wasn't much. But the critical to understanding the case and reading the Anthrax report is that it is predicated on the assumption, there's the built-in assumption that only one person did every piece of this case. Only one person grew the anthrax, dried it, put it into envelopes, mailed those envelopes. If it wasn't just one person, the whole case falls apart. Of course, they don't say that that's the built-in assumption when you read it. So the FBI failed to investigate all the labs that did have Ames anthrax. There are several overseas they did not investigate, as well as in the US. They failed to rule out hundreds of people who had access to the anthrax by claiming that these people lived too far away from the mailbox where the anthrax letters were mailed. Therefore, they couldn't have gotten there in time and gotten back to work. Again, predicated on the fact that only one person did every part of the crime. The most important part has already been gone over, which is that the silicon and the Bacillus subtilis contaminant were never found at Fort Detrick. The FBI ignored the possibility that anthrax could have been obtained from somewhere else. It could have been sitting around even for years, and that a different person mailed it. There could have been many people involved, but that was never considered in their theory of the case. They ignored statements from 5 other anthrax scientists, not all at Fort Detrick, who said it was impossible to make the anthrax in the letters in the period of time during which the FBI said it was made. So FBI said the letters that were dated on the accompanying letter 9/18/2001 had to have been made between the fall of the Twin Towers and 9/18, which was only 7 days, even though they weren't found until October. Since the FBI never was able, after either 40 attempts or 200 attempts, to reverse engineer and produce anthrax that looked like the anthrax in the second set of letters. That's because that silicon and perhaps tin and oxygen in the spore coat were very unusual. It wasn't clear how that was actually produced. It wasn't as if the spores were simply grown in a medium with extra silicon. That wouldn't have done this. Since they didn't know how it was produced, they couldn't possibly say that US AMRID or anywhere else had the necessary equipment to do it. Despite having Ivans under 24/7 surveillance, the FBI apparently failed to notice that he had gone twice the same day to a drugstore and twice bought Tylenol PM, which is Tylenol and Benadryl, and taken it, fallen into a coma, and then eventually was brought to the hospital. And the FBI did not inform the hospital that this was due to Tylenol poisoning. for which there is a very effective antidote if it's taken within the first 24 hours or a bit more. Very effective. Almost 100% saves if it's taken, if the antidote's taken appropriately. But of course, FBI needed a dead person so that they could close their case without a trial. It took the FBI an unexplained 10 months to swab the New Jersey mailboxes in the Trenton area looking for anthrax spores. Then they claimed they found a mailbox near a storage facility for the KKG sorority that Ivins had allegedly been obsessed with. You know, what did they really get the right mailbox? Big question. FBI initially claimed that the water the spores were grown in was shown using isotope analysis, I believe, to only have come from the Frederick area, and said that the envelope, that there was a tiny defect in the stamped envelope that the letters were mailed in, that was only sold at the Frederick, Maryland post office. And later the FBI had to walk back both of those two claims, which were not true. Again, the Anthrax report claimed that they assessed the scientists on the basis of whether they knew how to make the kind of anthrax in the letters. But since there's no evidence that anybody knew, we don't know a single person yet who knew how to make the anthrax in the second set of letters. So that's clearly fallacious. FBI claimed Ivins was working very late at night during the weeks before the letters were sent. But in fact, he was performing routine experiments, and the FBI covered that up. Eventually, it came out when somebody else FOIA'd for his lab notebooks. That was several years later. Ivan's so-called therapist, who just had a bachelor's degree and had quite a number of prior legal charges, was accompanied to the courthouse by an FBI agent to get a restraining order against Ivins. And much of the lurid claims about him all emanated from this one woman, who then disappeared to an undisclosed location, came out once a year later to make a rehearsed statement, and then disappeared again. FBI really wanted to have the last word on this case, in my opinion. And so they were not happy with the National Academy of Sciences report, understandably. And they had their own contractors write a rather ridiculous pop psychology analysis of Ivan's criminal mind. And so this got issued a month after the National Academy's report was issued. But it was utter nonsense and was widely ignored. The Government Accountability Office basically did issue the finding, and their report, which came out in 2014, essentially echoed the report of the National Academy of Sciences, saying that this whole story about the morphs, which I studied in great detail and many other people did for years, just turns out to be nothing. There was no validation. The morph analysis was just something made to look very complicated and important by the FBI, so they could claim they had this new scientific technique they were using. But it was basically meaningless when you look at it carefully. So that's what the GAO and the National Academies both said. Promising leads that were avoided by the FBI. First, there had been a study in Canada, and there had been a study in the US done that involved Steve Hatfill and William Patrick, surprisingly, of mailing anthrax in letters prior to 2001. And at least in the US study, I'm told, because these are classified, that it was ignored, it was missed, that anthrax could actually get through the paper of envelopes and leak out of these letters. And so it was thought that the perpetrator may well have been apprised of one or both of these studies And since the perpetrator also was apparently unaware that anthrax would leak, because they taped the edges of the letters in an apparent effort to prevent leakage. But FBI doesn't seem to have investigated people who had access to either of these classified reports. A letter, an odd letter, was mailed to the FBI center at Quantico, fingering a former colleague of Ivan's at Fort Detrick, Ayad Assad, as a biowarfare terrorist. And the letter had a lot of personal details about Assad, clearly seemed to have been written by somebody who had known him quite well, and preceded the identification of any anthrax cases. And so it seemed to indicate prior knowledge of the anthrax attacks, although it didn't specify that anthrax attacks were coming, but it specified bioterrorism. Who sent that letter should have been very interesting to the FBI, but to public knowledge, that was not pursued. Hoax letters there are a number of hoax letters. It's difficult to know for sure how many and where they came from, because the FBI kept very quiet about the hoax letters, but several were sent from St. Petersburg, Florida, around the same time as the real anthrax letters. You may remember that Judith Miller at the New York Times got a hoax letter, which she thought was anthrax initially. The FBI ought to have been very concerned as to who knew enough to send these hoax letters simultaneously. And again, they have not released any information about the hoax letters. And most of our information comes from an article by Donald Foster, who was asked as an FBI consultant to look at several of them, I believe. The Bacillus subtilis contaminant, it's common bacterium in the outdoors, can easily get into an anthrax culture. It happened to have a rare mutation, and the National Academy of Sciences suggested the FBI should have tried to investigate where that particular rare mutation came from, because that could have indicated where the anthrax in the letters had been made. But according to the NAS, FBI did not do so. Fifth issue is, of course, the first one you would think of, which is who benefits? What is the motive? Bruce Ivins didn't really need to bolster his career certainly after the anthrax letters were sent, but even before, there had been a great deal of talk about anthrax. There was talk, as soon as the Twin Towers were hit, lots of people were talking about, anthrax could be next. And I was getting calls in my office about anthrax before any anthrax letters were identified, talking about the possibility of anthrax being used as a bioweapon. The thing was, everybody knew or believed that Iraq had anthrax, and at one time it probably did. And in fact, the United States had transferred one of the Volum strains of anthrax to Iraq's Atomic Energy Agency through the American Type Culture Collection, and that transfer had to be registered with the Department of Commerce. I'm guessing, but I can guarantee you that the U.S. government was aware that this company in Manassas, Virginia, was transferring anthrax to Iraq. So we knew they had anthrax. We were pretty sure they had made anthrax. And this, by the way, was a strain that had been used by the United States early on as a strain that was weaponized for biological warfare in the 1940s and 50s. So the sending of the anthrax letters and the publicity that involved paved the way to war in Iraq, helped rush through the Patriot Act, and led to huge growth in the biodefense industry. So might anyone benefiting from those things have been involved with it. There's no evidence the FBI pursued those avenues. We already heard about Richard Lambert, who managed this case early on, and who has filed a lawsuit and made, I believe, affidavits. He's made signed statements that evidence exculpating Ivins, proving his innocence, was hidden by the FBI. And he's provided evidence of other ways the FBI tried not to solve the case. And we must never forget, who is Robert Mueller? Robert Mueller, who was the director of the FBI during the entire case. He came in right at the beginning, and he stayed till the end, certainly he stayed until after Ivan's death. I'm trying to remember when he left, but Mueller had been getting daily briefings for a long time on the case. He is central to the management of this case. He was complicit in covering up murders by both FBI agents and the Whitey Bulger gang they were working with in the Boston area when he was an attorney there. And I believe he was an assistant FBI director also there, but he may have simply been U.S. attorney. I'm not certain. These two references at the bottom will give you that information. He then continued to be complicit with keeping 4 honest FBI agents in jail, 2 of whom who died in jail, to cover up these criminal FBI agents, even as late as when he was the director of the FBI. He also covered up the crash of Pan Am 103, terrorist funding of BCCI, and the cover-up of the Twin Towers. So I doubt he would have any compunctions about covering up the Anthrax letters, and I would think he would be one of the people who knew how to effectively do that.
Yeah.
Just to end, I hope I've helped dismantle the Amerithrax theory of the case. I've added 3 extra slides as appendices, and I covered this case in extreme detail, as did many other people who commented on the blog during the years 2008 to 2011, if you want a very fine degree of detail in the case. And I'll just quickly run over the 3 slides. This talks a bit more about the conclusions of the GAO report in Science Magazine. This is a list of other patsies. These are other scientists or doctors who were harassed or investigated by the FBI before they settled on Bruce Ivins. And finally, I just added this little tidbit about Battelle, a nonprofit whose revenue was $5.1 billion in 2017, and which operates many of the United States government national labs. These are nuclear labs, biological defense labs. It's curious why the US government has decided to outsource some of these very critical roles to a private organization. And it's probably worth noting that this private organization is not subject to the Freedom of Information Act, so it can conduct its business in secrecy. So thank you very much.
Well, that's an amazing presentation there. And what you've just said at the end, I don't mean to irritate Mick by keep coming back to this, but this sounds like the biological version of CrowdStrike. They create a cutout that is a private company. Amazingly, this one is protected from paying taxes as a 501c3 nonprofit corporation. Mm-hmm. And they can do things through this private company that the FBI cannot do. If the one and only thing that they're doing is shielding it from Freedom of Information Act requests, that could be the reason.
Right. Is it the Lawyers Committee? We haven't taken a position on that, but personally, I can agree with you. Lawyers Committee just hasn't, decided on that interesting proposition you just said.
Well, thank you for that really excellent presentation, Meryl. I think we've got some more to come right now from Graeme. Are we ready to go to our next speaker?
I'm ready. Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. It's an honor to speak with such wonderful people. Meryl was onto this case before I got onto it and was one of those people whose work inspired me to do some work on it. In 2014, I brought out a book. I'm not here to flog it, but I don't know, you probably can't read it. It's called The 2001 Anthrax Deception. And I guess it's probably because I did that work that I was invited to join the Lawyers Committee's Anthrax Working Group. That's what I'm calling it. The Anthrax Working Group. It's been a pleasure to work with people on that group for the last 6 months. It's a pleasure to be here today to announce this petition to Congress and the upcoming petition for a grand jury. What I want to do in my time is take a step back, because long before I got involved in this issue, I was the director of a Center for Peace Studies at my university in Canada, and I've been involved for decades in issues having to do with war and peace. I noticed that war is a time when even the most democratic countries tend to tighten up and become more authoritarian, and sometimes when the war is over, they don't go back to being as democratic as they were before. And I want to look at, I'm interested in the idea of attacks on legislatures. Threats, intimidation, attacks on our elected representatives, which are a direct threat to democracy and which I came to conclude are a major feature of the war on terror. So the war on terror is simultaneously a war on democracy. One last little comment before I plunge in. Disclaimer, these are my views and don't necessarily represent the views of the Lawyers Committee. Okay, so what I want to do first is, it's a bit autobiographical because I want to say a few words about two cases in my own country, Canada, which awakened me to this pattern. And then I will go to 19 years ago and the events that we're mainly focusing on today and see how they fit the pattern. And the pattern is the physical intimidation of legislatures. Okay, so the first Canadian case, 2013, the second Canadian case, 2014. We had two successive attacks on legislatures in my country. 2013, two so-called homegrown Islamic extremists put two pressure cooker bombs, which turned out to be duds, but nevertheless, two pressure cooker bombs on the grounds of the provincial legislature in British Columbia. In other words, physical intimidation of a legislature. The year following that, an even more shocking event took place where another so-called homegrown Islamic extremist, who was also from Vancouver, who was also a drug addict like the other poor characters, was found to have committed the worst security breach in Canadian parliamentary history when he shot a soldier at the War Memorial in our capital city of Ottawa, and then managed to, with his rifle, run into the front door of Parliament, center block of Parliament, run down the hall, yards from the Prime Minister and his caucus, which were meeting behind an unlocked door at the time, before falling in a hail of bullets. He was supposedly died with 31 9mm bullets in him. So he too was represented a threat to Parliament, in this case a shocking threat to federal Parliament, which had very particular consequences. Now, I just want to say very briefly that my conclusion after studying both of these cases is that both issued from our own security services, not from Islamic extremists, that these people were handled. In the case of the 2013 attack, we don't have to guess, because the perpetrators survived those events and there was a trial. And you know that whenever there's a trial, there's always a danger that an honest person may get involved and that things may happen which the perpetrators did not want to happen. And that's what occurred in the 2013 trial. The case was caught by a judge, Justice Catherine Bruce, who was brave and honest and angry when she saw how our federal police, the RCMP, had manipulated these pathetic characters and had entrapped them. And so she threw the case out. Technically, she issued a stay on the proceedings, and her 134-page judgment is definitely worth reading. It was a terrific black eye to our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who stage managed this event from the beginning to the end, producing the so-called martyrdom video, even filming it, convincing these poor people to carry out a jihad act, telling them what kind of jihad act would be useful, suggesting a pressure cooker bomb, telling them they could help build it, helping them in fact to build it, constantly supporting them when they had doubts and said they didn't want to kill anyone, and finally driving them around town and showing them a nice place to put the pressure cooker bombs right beside the legislature. So this is an outrageous example of the police intimidating a provincial legislature in my country. And in this case, they were caught red-handed doing it. The following year, 2014, perhaps they learned their lesson. If you make sure the perpetrator ends up dead, then there will be no court case, there will be no trial, there will be no serious attempt to discover what happened. And indeed, the only investigations that took place were carried out by the police themselves. They failed even to ask the most serious questions, never mind answer these questions. I realized that at that point, I had spent years studying 9/11 attacks, and I thought, here's an attack happening in my own country that looks fishy to me. That picture you see on your screen, by the way, is the alleged perpetrator of the 2014 attack, Michael Zehaf-Bibeau. So I said, look, this is happening in my own country. I better look into it. And I wrote a 75-page report on it, which did not get widely published, but it's called the October 22nd, 2014 Ottawa shootings, Why Canadians Need a Public Inquiry. But of course, there has been no public inquiry. I don't have the time here to persuade you that this was another police operation, but that's what I concluded. And my booklet ends up with 34 questions, which I say are important unanswered questions for the police. And despite 2 years of Freedom of Information requests, I have not received a single answer to a single one of those questions. Indeed, I emerged from the process with even more questions. A couple of years ago, I and a few friends discovered the very specific parking space that Michael Zehaf-Bibeau was parked in when he made his martyrdom video on his cell phone. And that parking space, you will be happy to know, was a hidden semi-underground parking space right across the street from the Ottawa police station. You will have to take my word for it for the moment that both of these are very fishy events, and I don't know a single mainstream journalist in my country who pointed to an astonishingly disturbing pattern which emerges when we look at these, and that is the police, the security services in our country, deliberately intimidating two legislatures, one provincial and one federal. Now, you may say, why would they do that? And there are numerous reasons, but let me be quite specific. In some cases, there are specific pieces of legislation that they want to get passed, and this legislation will give more power to security services and take away power from citizens and their representatives. In the case of the 2014 attack, and you see you hopefully see on your screen my little booklet. In the case of the 2014 attack, there were two bills, Bill C-13 and Bill C-51, especially C-51, which were passed. C-51 was passed quite explicitly, quite clearly, because of the terrorist attacks on Parliament. And it gave more power to security services, and it took away power from citizens. So that is what led me to see this dangerous pattern. And I have to assume that most of my audience aren't much interested in what happens in Canada. So now we will fly to the United States, and we will fly to 19 years ago to look at two cases where the same pattern is found. The first is 9/11 itself. When we read the memoirs of Tom Daschle, Senate Majority Leader at that time, we will find that he was watching the astonishing news of 9/11 on the television in a room in the Capitol when a police officer ran into the room, or a security officer ran into the room and said, "We have news, there is a plane headed this way. We need to evacuate the Capitol immediately." So that was done. According to Daschle, the scene was total chaos. There was no protocol, there was no plan. Representatives and senators scattered to the four directions in a panic. In other words, the attacks had indeed intimidated a legislature. Now we find a timid regathering of Congress on the steps of the Capitol that evening, where people hugged each other, sang "God Bless America" together, and made brave little speeches about how we will not be intimidated. And I don't really want to make fun of, there they are on the steps of the Capitol. I don't want to make fun of them because it's a very natural human reaction. We've been attacked by a dangerous external force. We must unite together, put aside party politics, support our president, blah, blah, blah. There's nothing wrong with the reaction, except that, as some people would say, you've gone through amygdala hijack. In other words, you're scared, you're freezing up, you are not thinking, you're not using your brain. And at that point, you are easy to manipulate. And I believe that's exactly what happened. So were they intimidated? You bet they were. And there was a very concrete outcome, namely that 3 days later, on September the 14th, they passed a bill authorizing the use of force by the President of the United States against whoever he judged had committed the 9/11 attacks. They therefore gave away their power and gave power to the executive branch, which was clearly seizing power. And it seized power in an astonishing way. The Constitution allows the president to be the commander-in-chief in a time of war and to have certain powers he normally wouldn't have. And that's exactly what Bush did, and pushed aside various restraints and constraints that he would normally have had. He became the warlord, Mr. Bush. So that's what happened on 9/11 in brief. And what happened in the Anthrax attacks, this is where I'm headed here. And I have, I hope, a couple of minutes left to take you through this step by step. The Anthrax attacks were clearly planned before 9/11, but as far as we know, they began about a week after. Meanwhile, right after 9/11, Attorney General Ashcroft had said, "I'm going to be proposing a new bill to Congress, which gives security forces more power." They didn't call it the Patriot Act yet, but that's what it became called. "And I want it passed immediately." He literally wanted it passed in a couple of days, even though it was a very large bill and nobody had read it. Well, there were a few people who fought back and who said, we need to take a little more time here. And we'll get to the two most important people in Congress who fought back in a moment. Meanwhile, between 9/11 and September 30th, all these rumors of anthrax began coming around. Meryl mentioned this. Very odd, really, because the first actual diagnosis of somebody having the disease of anthrax was October 3rd. That was Robert Stevens. Meanwhile, for a couple of weeks before that, we have so many rumors of anthrax that people are running out and buying Cipro as you know, to take in case they get the disease of anthrax. In any case, let's skip to September 30th. By this point, the Patriot Act has not yet been passed. Ashcroft is very angry. He keeps telling the Democrats that they're leading to their recalcitrance is putting the whole country, including Congress, at risk. And on September 30th, the New York Times has on its front page that something to the effect that experts say there may be a germ attack. And we have an offensive on that day by members of the administration in order to get this passed by October 5th. The October 5th deadline seems to have been first announced by Vice President Cheney, but other members of the administration supported it. So let me just review that again. The administration chooses October 5th as the deadline by which they want the Patriot Act passed. Slightly before that, September 30th, they gang up to say why it's important to honor that deadline. White House Chief of Staff Andrew Card says, quote, "This is all on September 30th. Nobody's been diagnosed with anthrax yet." Quote, "Terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda have probably found the means to use biological or chemical warfare." Meanwhile, same day, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld says terrorists could be equipped by their state sponsors with weapons of mass destruction. Same day, September 30th, Tommy Thompson, Secretary of Health and Human Services, speaks on CBS of a possible, quote, bioterrorism attack. All of this very strange, coming as it does before anybody has been diagnosed with anthrax, before anybody is supposed to know of a bioterrorism attack. Well, the thing is, the October 5th deadline for passing the Patriot Act fails. That is to say, two Democratic senators, slow down the bill so that it is not passed by October 5th. Who are they? They are Senator Tom Daschle, Senate Majority Leader, and Senator Patrick Leahy, Chief of the Judiciary Committee, both crucial to the passage of the Patriot Act, both identified by the Washington Post at the time as the two and only two senators who are slowing it down and responsible for missing the October 5th deadline. So then what happens? Somewhere between October 6th, one day after that deadline, and October 9th, two letters are put in the mail in which there is extremely sophisticated anthrax spores, potentially lethal anthrax spores. And who's it sent to? Who are they sent to? Senators Leahy and Daschle. Now, you and I, my friends, are supposed to be so dumb that we can make no connection between all the threats and the October 5th deadline and those letters. We are supposed to believe that Bruce Ivins, who had no conceivable motive that has been discovered for wanting to threaten these two Democratic senators, we are supposed to believe that he's the one who sent the letters. To this day, that's what we're supposed to believe. Well, you've already heard good talks today that should lead you to question that conclusion. And both of the petitions put out by the Lawyers Committee will give a great deal of further detail on that issue. Ivins was an innocent man hounded to his death by the FBI. And it's time that was widely spoken of. And I conclude with to reiterate my theme: in this war on terror, we have seen a war on democracy. In my country and in your country, the United States, legislatures have been physically intimidated by the executive branch and by their security agencies. This is an extremely dangerous development that we must talk about. And frequently after talks like this, people say, well, what can I do? In this case, it's good to be able to say there's something very clear that you can do, and that is go on the Lawyers for 9/11 Inquiry, Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry, go on their website, read their 9/11 petition, read their petition to Congress, which should be up today, I hope, read their coming petition for a grand jury on the Anthrax Attacks, which should be up sometime in the month of October. Make these well known. Speak out, be loud, make a fuss. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right. Good.
excellent presentation, Graeme. And I would add to that while people are on lcfor911.org, the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry website, I want to make sure that people are aware that they can click on the donate button and financially support the efforts of the Lawyers Committee. It's very important. And, Graeme, I'm absolutely blown away by the presentation from each of the speakers that we've had today. The things that you've raised, it's just so fascinating to me how bringing together all the different people that we have as guests on Crowdsource the Truth always seems to lead to more connections, because for a long time I've been looking at this photograph of some possible swamp monsters. We've got U.S. presidential candidate Joe Biden, perhaps when his cognition was superior to what it is today, along with the two-time Attorney General of the United States, here serving in that role in his first term under Poppy Bush, GHW, and you've answered the question that I'm not sure that anybody else has been able to tell us before. It appears that they're with Senator Leahy right there.
Well, Attorney General Barr, he is a defendant. We're suing him.
Good.
In the right here in New York City, in the Southern District, over the grand jury petition. He's named.
Yes, and he was also playing a pivotal role in issuing pardons to people who participated in the Iran-Contra scandal. And I am very interested in photographs and body language and intuitive things that we can derive from observing people. And in this picture, I see two men on the left side of the frame looking at Senator Leahy in the way a starving man looks at a roasted chicken. This guy looks like he's on the chopping block. I don't know. What do we think about this picture? Obviously, we can't derive too much from it, but I thank you so much, Graeme, for filling in that context.
I wanted to follow up with Graeme on one thing, and that's the death of Paul Wellstone and the connection maybe with the war in Iraq. In your research, were you thinking of including that at all, or did you look into that?
Well, again, speaking for myself here, not the Lawyers Committee.
Yeah, for yourself.
And I haven't done any really serious research on it. But yes, I assume Wellstone was assassinated.
Right.
That's my assumption. As you know, there is reason to believe that former Vice President Cheney was running a domestic assassination program. And I don't know why we shouldn't just say that. I mean, I think it's pretty clear.
And one last question, too. In reference to not government officials, but necessarily with the scientists, and Meryl may be able to get in on that. There was a lot of microbiologists, top-notch scientists that were dying in a period of a few months right after 9/11. Have you given that any consideration or thought was that connected to what? Do you know?
I don't know. They were not anthrax people. One had maybe some slight relationship to anthrax, but they were not names that I otherwise knew.
Right. Okay.
Well, I mean, this has been really remarkable. Is there another topic that we'd like to cover, Dave? We've been through our panel now. Do we want some questions? How would you like to proceed? We've got a little bit more time here.
Well, I'm so honored to be associated with the three people that spoke here. All right, all outstanding and amazing presentations. I think from my perspective, it's just to try to get the word out that there is another side to the story, and that the Lawyers Committee is intent in investigating these serious crimes of 9/11, as you mentioned before, Jason. It's been a pivot. Ever since then, things have been closing down. And we have, in some ways, 24/7 surveillance.
Yeah.
And we've lost a lot of our freedoms because of that day not being properly investigated. So we have an event coming up, a big event, the Lawyers Committee on Sunday, which Meryl and Graeme will be at, and Mick and myself. And that's sponsored too, it's co-sponsored with the Truth Action Project, which is called TAP. And so the Lawyers Committee and TAP are going to be putting that together. And we have a host of amazing speakers, including Francis Boyle, who is a world's expert on bioweapons. And this was the first bioweapon attack on, certainly on a congressional people. And that's what we're looking at. I'm sure this is the beginning of bioweapons, but there might be some more analysis of bioweapons up to today that impact all of us. But maybe I would like to turn it over to the speakers. Maybe they have some points that they want to raise, they think are really important. And maybe just start in the order that they were speaking. Mick, what did you want to clear up or clarify that you think is important that people should know?
Well, we covered the petition to Congress pretty well. The one thing I would like to add is our upcoming filing to the grand jury. You had mentioned that we might want to talk about the laws that would address. If you think that's appropriate, I can give Jason the short version of what that petition will address.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Why don't you do the short version of the laws that are impacted here with our future grand jury petition?
So it's probably stating the obvious, but the anthrax attacks involved the crime of using weapons of mass destruction, which is a federal statute. It involved using the mail to distribute poisonous and dangerous materials, a separate crime under federal law. Obviously involved murder, unfortunately, involved attempts to kill a federal official, which is a separate crime. And we may not have made it as explicit as we could, but there were two senators, Daschle and Leahy, who received the highly sophisticated, very lethal anthrax mailed to them. And to me, and the facts we've looked at, it appears to be an attempt to assassinate those two United States senators. There was anthrax found in other buildings, in some Congress people's offices, and in the Supreme Court building. We're still looking at the significance of that. The use and retention of a biological agent is a crime. Destroying federal property, of course, is a crime. The one crime that maybe folks aren't thinking about in regard to these anthrax attacks is the crime of treason. But because you have essentially an admission by the federal government that this was a domestic source for these anthrax attacks from within the United States, and it targeted federal officials, including two senators, it basically qualifies, unfortunately, for the crime of treason. So that's the short version.
Okay, Mick, thanks a lot. Meryl, could you give us a summation of what you think is important in a minute or two?
This isn't a summation, but I think the American people have known for a long time that criminality has been part of the FBI because, under J. Edgar Hoover, we knew that. And subsequently, criminality has been part and parcel of some behaviors of the FBI, so this is our primary federal internal, police organization. And then we have the CIA, which initially was only allowed to work outside the United States, but now is allowed to work internally in the United States as well. And we know that they too have been associated with criminality, with drug crimes in particular, but other crimes as well. And as the noose tightens for Americans with the surveillance state and all of our electronic information being collected, are we still going to tolerate having criminality at the center of our law enforcement agencies? And how can we come to grips with this? We have never acknowledged it. Most people, you don't talk about these things in nice company. And I believe and now we are being prevented from talking to each other in person most of the time because of the coronavirus. And perhaps that is part and parcel of the plan, is to keep us separated. But I think what we talk about in polite company now needs to change. And I hope everybody will think about that.
Thank you. Graeme, do you have the last word?
Well, you've heard lots from me. I don't think I need to say too many more things, but two brief comments. I don't want to take us off on a wild goose chase by talking about COVID-19, but Meryl brought it up. So let me just say that legislatures almost everywhere in the world are weakened at the moment. I just read a report by, I don't remember what it's called, I was looking for it here, something like the Union of Legislatures, going through one country after another. Subcommittees suspended, normal activities interrupted, attempts to use Zoom instead of meeting in person, masks, social distancing, and a lot of power going to executives. And that, in fact, is a lawsuit in Canada by attorney Rocco Galati against the federal government. And one of the first things he says is that you have dispensed with Parliament and you have violated our Constitution. So we need to think about this weakening of legislatures, regardless of what you think about the pandemic, why it came about, what it is, doesn't matter. These things are happening. These are things that we need to worry about. Are things going to return to normal after the pandemic? We don't know. Final thing I'll say is that we've been encouraged to forget about the anthrax attacks, that these were minor things. Didn't they find the guy? A few letters. Oh yeah, I vaguely remember that. Whereas in fact, I think it could be the gateway to these deep state deceptions. And I think we're really on to something with these petitions, and we really need to pursue this forcefully.
Okay. Fantastic, thanks. And from me, Jason, I just want to say that, first of all, thank you very much. The Lawyers Committee thanks you very much for giving us the time. What we're trying to do is we're doing our share in pushing back this police state. It has to be pushed back. The thing that's really important, at least in my life, and I think it's in the Lawyers Committee, is our Constitution and our freedoms. And we have to protect the Constitution. It's been trampled on by our representatives, and we have to restore our country in the proper way. So these petitions will help do that. At least we're pushing back. We're doing what we can do as citizens, and we ask for your support at Lawyers Committee, lc4for911.org. And thanks a lot, and hopefully we can do it again sometime in the future with more good news.
Absolutely. And I want to thank each of you, each of our panel members today for joining us. It's always my pleasure to be involved with the good work that you guys are doing. And of course, tomorrow we're commemorating the 19th. I hate to use the word anniversary because it seems celebratory, but it's hard to believe it's been almost 2 decades since I stood on the roof of this very building and watched the World Trade Center burn. Friends of mine in the building were killed. And we still have no answers.
Right. For people that are watching, the World Trade Center is probably about a mile from here, or was. We're right here in that energy. And as Jason said, he watched it. And we're all feeling that experience still. The whole nation was traumatized. So we have to reclaim ourselves and get back to being Americans in the most positive way.
And let me just take one more opportunity to invite people to visit the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry website. You can find it at lc4for911.org. And I do want to encourage viewers to make a financial contribution. It's a 501c3, so your financial contribution is tax deductible. And it really helps to do the type of work that the government needs to be doing. We are going to drain the swamp in our own way. Got to root out that plug and just start the draining happening. Really, 9/11 and an investigation into it, a proper investigation, would go a long way towards doing that. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to encourage viewers to sponsor Crowdsource the Truth by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. no corporate sponsor that I'm aware of would even allow this type of conversation. So it's important that the viewer sponsors keep Crowdsource the Truth going so that I can continue to bring you important presentations like this. I want to wish each of you a pleasant day. Thanks for joining me, and thanks everybody for watching. Got a few more programs coming up today, so stay tuned. Have a great day.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.